All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Imagine for a second being a kid growing up in the most extraordinary environment you could possibly think of. Taken into the Prophet Muhammad's household, you're quite literally watching revelation descend. You're intimately witnessing the birth of an entire ummah before it even exists as a public reality. Well, this early, continuous exposure shaped a mind, a soul, and a character in a way that was completely unprecedented.
And that brings us to this incredibly profound statement from the Prophet. I am the city of knowledge and Ali is its gate. Ali wasn't just a participant, He wasn't just observing early Islam. He was deliberately elevated as the entry point, the custodian, and the transmitter of prophetic wisdom. His proximity to the absolute source was entirely unique.
To get the full picture of his life, here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover his proximity to the source, his role as the unwavering protector, the impossible caliphate, the peak of eloquence, and finally, his ultimate victory. Let's get into it.
Starting with Section 1, Proximity to the Source. First to believe, first to serve. Ali was actually the very first child to consciously accept Islam at around 10 years old, a conscious affirmation of the absolute truth he'd lived and breathed right there in the Prophet's home.
Now think about the timeline of his early years. In 622 CE, on the incredibly tense and dangerous night of the Hijrah, assassins literally gathered outside to murder the Prophet. And what does Ali do? He fearlessly volunteers to sleep in the Prophet's bed. Wrapped in the Prophet's green cloak, he acted as a decoy, knowing full well that those armed men were coming to kill whoever was lying there. Talk about nerves of steel.
But what's really mind-blowing is what happened right after that night. The Prophet, who is known as Al-Amin, the trustworthy, trusted Ali to stay behind in Mecca for several days. Why? Literally just to return valuables and deposits back to the very Meccans who had just tried to assassinate him. It perfectly defines Ali's character. Absolute fulfillment of obligations, even when you're in extraordinary danger.
That incredible bravery takes us to Section 2, the unwavering protector, the sword of Islam. Let's shift gears to his unmatched battlefield record.
The man was a constant, unshakable force. At Badr, he was in fierce combat at just 21 years old, taking down several champions. At Uhud, when the tide turned and utter chaos broke out, he was one of the very few who planted himself firmly beside the Prophet as a human shield. At Khandaq, the Battle of the Trench, he won an absolutely decisive duel. And at Khaybar, after the Prophet miraculously healed his inflamed eyes, Ali carried the flag and famously pulled the massive fortress gate right off its hinges.
But to really understand the complete man, you have to look at this stark contrast. Battlefield valor on one side, household humility on the other. Despite being this fierce military powerhouse, his home life was incredibly simple. When he proposed to the Prophet's beloved daughter, Fatima, he had almost no wealth. He actually used his own armor as her dowry. And inside their home, you'd find this great warrior grinding grain and drawing water right alongside his wife.
See these numbers, 33, 33, and 34. When Ali and Fatima went to the Prophet to ask for a servant to help with their exhausting daily chores, the Prophet didn't give them domestic help. Instead, he gifted them something totally different, a famous tasbih, the instruction to say Subhanallah 33 times, Alhamdulillah 33 times, and Allahu Akbar 34 times before going to sleep. This spiritually rich but materially humble household is exactly what nurtured the Prophet's beloved grandsons, Hassan and Hussein.
Which brings us to Section 3, the impossible Caliphate, principled governance in crisis. Keep in mind, before taking power himself, Ali was already a massive pillar and a highly trusted advisor to the entire community.
So, at age 58, Ali finally accepts the Caliphate, but he steps into it during an unprecedented existential and political crisis. He inherited a completely fractured community, consumed by civil conflicts like the battles of the Camel, Siffin, and Naharawan. He was suddenly pitted against people he previously respected and faced heartbreaking betrayals from former allies who became the Khawarij. It was, to put it mildly, a staggeringly heavy burden.
Yet in the middle of all that absolute chaos, his principles literally never wavered. Just listen to this from a letter he wrote to his newly appointed governor of Egypt, Malik al-Ashtar. Devote yourself with a full heart. Do not be to the strong a support against the weak. It perfectly captures his unwavering commitment to justice and mercy for the everyday person. He completely rejected political expediency or corruption.
And in that exact same correspondence, he tells him, "Know that you have been placed as a shield between Allah and the people.
For Ali, leadership was absolutely not a throne for worldly gain or a platform to stroke your own ego. It was a terrifying trust, a profound, direct accountability before Allah to protect the vulnerable.
And that philosophical depth naturally bridges us to Section 4, the peak of eloquence, the wisdom of Najul Balagha.
The Najul Balagha, which translates to the peak of eloquence, is this defining collection of Ali's speeches, letters, and wisdom. It perfectly bridges the gap between his chaotic political reality and his immense intellectual capability. It's studied all over the world today, not just for theology, but as an absolute masterpiece of Arabic literature and governance ethics. It captures a mind shaped entirely by that childhood proximity to revelation we were talking about earlier.
Just take a look at this quote. "The world is a transient shadow. Whoever lived in it was as though he never was." You can see this is a man totally liberated from the fear of death. He possesses reckless courage on the battlefield, but profound patience in governance. And it was all rooted in his absolute certainty of what comes after this fleeting, temporary world.
And when it came to fairness, he hit the nail on the head. Justice is to weigh things on the same scale for all. Injustice is to weigh them differently. The crucial takeaway here is that even while fighting bitter, heartbreaking civil wars, his strict adherence to equal justice for both his closest friends and his defeated enemies never, ever changed. No double standards. None.
This incredible steadfastness brings us to our final chapter, Section 5, the final victory. Fustua Rabbi Yidi Jin.
On the 19th of Ramadan, while leading the Fajr prayer, he was struck by an assassin's poisoned sword. But pay attention to his response. Even while bleeding from a fatal strike by Abdel Rahman ibn Muljem, his only demand was humane treatment for his killer. He explicitly instructed his sons not to use torture or mutilation, but to treat his assassin with basic human decency. Unbelievable grace under the worst possible circumstances.
And his very first words upon being struck? Fuztu Rabbi, which translates to, "I have won, by my Lord." Talk about a paradigm shift. What looked to the rest of the world like a devastating, bloody defeat was, to Ali, the ultimate spiritual victory. It was the martyr's passing that the Prophet had told him about, the exact moment he had spent his entire life preparing for. So, what do we take away from this immense life? Well, proximity to truth still requires a personal choice, just like he chose Islam at age 10. Leadership is a heavy trust, not a throne to sit on. Victory isn't defined by worldly political outcomes, but by divine acceptance. And finally, a person's true capability is never measured by the limiting circumstances they find themselves in. Ali reminds us that true character is holding on to your principles when the world hands you every single excuse to abandon them. I'm going to leave you with a final thought to mull over today. The Prophet said Ali is the gate to the city of knowledge. Well, that gate is still wide open today through his enduring wisdom, his pristine example, and his unbreakable principles. So how will you enter, and what wisdom will you carry forward into your own life? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep reflecting, and I'll catch you next time.